The problem is all worldviews are totalizing. Islam doesn't come and say, oh, we just want to have our own diet. No, Islam wants America to be Muslim.
Joe Boo, welcome back to Strong Church. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So we kind of ran out of time a little bit on the last interview, which I expected because these are some big topics, and they're not things that can really be just dealt with at a surface level. So we're talking about this issue of God's law, what at times is referred to as theonomy, and kind of the application of that. You had presented this idea essentially, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, that God's law, ideally we get to a point that we have righteousness rising up in society that is creating a world where people want to live by these laws, and we're celebrating this. But it brings into questions of, like, what do you do with people that maybe don't want to celebrate, these ideas? I know in times past we've had blasphemy laws, we've had, all these sorts of things. How do you deal with this issue of pluralism, especially in a place like America that is so diverse, of so many different backgrounds? I just finished a book on paganism. We got 1.5 million practicing pagans right now in the United States, and the number's expected to double or triple by 2050. How do we navigate these things in light of God's law, without just creating a world where we're forcing conversion on people in some form?
Yeah. Well, I think the first good step is actually to be educated and aware about the origin of our own constitutional life and the laws and structures that have actually shaped and informed us. So very often this is kind of seen as something new and scary, but it's not. It's actually about the root, the foundation of our cultural life. So we're actually appealing to something that has a venerable and long history in the life of our nation. In
both England and the United States.
Very much so. Or really the Anglosphere.
Yes, 100%.
Across the board. You mentioned a blasphemy law. England and Wales didn't repeal the blasphemy law until 2008.
Wow.
And that's because of the religious change that you're talking about. So it follows that you're going to see those kinds of changes as a culture de-Christianizes. But if it's re-Christianizing, right? If there's renewal, restoration, then you're going to see changes in the life of the law as well. I think in terms of the question about pluralism, there's a difference between structural pluralism and what I would call polytheism. By structural pluralism, I mean the recognition that there are different spheres of authority and the different institutions that God has established in society. The state, for example, the family, the life of the church, the economic sphere, and so forth. And these are to be governed in terms of, from a scriptural standpoint, in terms of God's law for them. The law for the family and for is not the identical to the law of the state for the church, and so on. What we don't want is a situation. What people are often scared of is more what I would call an ecclesiocracy, where the idea is that the church starts to swallow the state or the family, the various areas of cultural life, and that clergy or pastors are sort of ruling or tyrannizing over, which we saw to a degree with the papal theocracy of the medieval period, where there was a kind of, let's call it an ecclesiasticizing of culture, where the pixie dust of the church just had to be sprinkled everywhere of the church institute. Whereas in the founding of the United States, there was a recognition that God is over the nation, but we don't have to establish a church at the federal level, right? We can have freedom. So structural pluralism would mean that whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist or a Muslim or a Jedi warrior, that in your own family and the educational decisions you make for your children, you can believe what you want. You can teach your children. You can send them to the schools that you want them to go to, and so on and so forth. But there still has to be, from a Christian standpoint, one law for all, and that idea of the rule of law is basic to Scripture, and it's basic to the history of the West. We're given it throughout Deuteronomy and Exodus. There's one law for the foreigner, the alien, the stranger, and for the native born. And that idea of the rule of law is basic to American history and British history. Without the rule of one law, you basically have a polytheistic, unstable culture.
Well, let's give a practical application of this, because you've seen this, I'm sure, in England. And you also mentioned your parents had done missionary work in Pakistan and places like that. Right now I think it was. We had Texas just voting on basically that Sharia law would not be allowed within the state of Texas, and there are major attempts right now to try to get that two-law system in operation. And for the sake of if we just go libertarian for a second and kind of for the sake of religious pluralism, I can see people making arguments, well, they should have the right to be able to do this. Well, when those laws are in opposition to one another, this becomes really problematic. And so we're not just talking about, within their own family that somebody they want to follow a particular dietary plan, that honors a system that they believe in. We're defining like when it's okay to when it's okay to stone somebody, when it's okay, to be able to treat somebody, terribly. I mean, when you start looking at what Sharia law allows for, this is against the Western framework of life. It's against God's law that we see, in the Decalogue and in, both, Torah and New Testament continuation of that. And so, talk to us more about, from a practical standpoint, what are we seeing right now, even with Islam, and let's use that as an example to unpack this.
It's the best example right now. Take Britain, for example. We've got over 100, probably a lot more than that, 100 Sharia courts acting as courts of arbitration, functioning in the United Kingdom with the permission of civil law.
Wow.
We have.
So what is that? Does that allow for the full extent somebody be, what
theoretically, no.
Okay.
So it's supposed to be only within the framework of British civil law.
Okay.
But that's not the way Islam works.
Right.
And the goal of Islam, in Islam there is the House of Islam and there's the House of War, and the goal of Islam is Islam is Sharia, Sharia is Islam.
Yeah.
So the goal is to realize Sharia for the social order. And so, for example, when these courts of arbitration in Britain are dealing with marriage issues and so forth, well, they're ruling in terms of Sharia law. Although it's not allowed technically under English civil law, there are men who have got multiple wives under Sharia law in Britain. And this is exactly the point of the difference between structural pluralism, where we recognize distinct spheres of authority and jurisdiction. So it's not for the state to move into every single area of life with its own law and violate the distinctive law sphere, say, of the family or the life of the church. But the constitutional law of the land, the standing law of the land, which was rooted in the Decalogue, there has to be one law. If you cannot have a situation that you've described where another law order comes in and says, this law order, which represents actually another God, because all law orders represent a divinity concept, has to be on an equal footing with this law. No, if you want to come and live in America or Canada, this is what the Christian would need to say, or Britain, then you're coming to live under Christian law. There's one law for the stranger, the alien, and the native born. The problem with secularism is it's blind to, it thought that what it could do is it could establish itself as the worldview to govern society, and that it would treat all the other religious worldviews as basically equal, and that it would referee between them. And as long as they all offered incense on the altar of the secular state, they can all go and practice. It's like ancient Rome. They can all go and practice their religion. The problem is all worldviews are totalizing. Islam doesn't come and say, oh, we just want to have our own diet. No, Islam wants America to be Muslim. Wants an Islamic state here. It wants Britain to be an Islamic state. That's the nature of Islam. Christianity doesn't just want, it will be the case that the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. They will submit to the lordship of Jesus Christ. We have different routes of getting there, but all worldviews are in the end totalizing. Secularism is totalizing. It doesn't want to tolerate Christian law. There's a struggle there. So that's why there is always a limit. There must be a limit to religious freedom, because in the end, religio or religere, to tie or to bind, is the origin of the word. literally has to do with how you bind a society together. Well, if you introduce multiple law orders, multiple gods, that culture ghettoizes. It balkanizes.
Right, yeah.
And then
That's a great description on that.
And then it becomes at war with itself.
Yeah.
So Islamic law, unlike biblical law, is not nascent within the history of America or the United Kingdom or Canada. It's not present in its history. It's a foreign law. And the mosque represents is a picture of not just the presence of Islam, but the claim of Islam over a given culture. The minaret with its call to prayer, that's the goal. I think in Minnesota, this is actually happening.
First time I ever heard that was in Nairobi. Went there in 2008 and woke up, to that sound in the morning. And now we're seeing that, here in the U.S. I mean, obviously it's been happening around the world, a lot of places for, hundreds of years. But how do we navigate that? If you were, sitting right now before the world leaders, and let's just assume that they all listen to Strong Church podcasts, what would be your advice in this situation that we're in?
Yeah. So if I was Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell briefly, or if I'm sat in front of Western leaders in terms of Western nations, I would explain to them that religious worldviews are totalizing. They mean to move into every area of life. Sharia law, for example, governs not just your diet, not just economic life and loans and debt or marriage. It governs even how you go to the bathroom. I mean, it governs literally every aspect of a person's life. Yeah. And that this is a law order that will not live with, and cannot live with, if it's to be authentic, the Christian view of law. And that means that you would have to look at levels of immigration. I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? Yeah. You'd have to look at where are migrants coming from? What is the strength of our oath as a nation? Like, to become part of a nation, to be a citizen, what does that require? Yeah. Because nations are covenantal in character. They're not essentially ethnic. They're covenantal. There's a religious route to nationhood. So we would need to be thinking about immigration. What is the oath that's required of people? And we need to be asking questions about levels of integration. We'd need to be looking at the deportation, obviously, of illegals. And I think we actually let's take Britain, for example, where you're approaching 7% or more of the country being Muslim at this point. If people are unwilling to integrate and steadfastly refuse to integrate, and will not recognize and submit to the broadly historically Christian law order, then we have to think about the deportation and even the revocation of acquired citizenship, because in the end it's so destabilizing. You only have to look at France or Germany. Unless we face the reality, and I know we're picking on Islam here, it's one illustration, but it's the dominant illustration that is outside of the woke progressive Marxism, where we've undermined ourselves in the West, and we've been destroying our own social order. What rushes in to fill some of these voids, Islam has been allowed in to take a major foothold. It's not as serious an issue in America in terms of percentage-wise. It is in some areas, but it's growing.
Yeah, for sure growing. I mean, you have the Minneapolises, the Dearborn, Michigans. We're seeing, attempts to do that in Texas and different places. And so, that's becoming a real concern for people. And I think that, again, these are the issues that would have been interesting for guys like you over a cup of coffee, you guys like you or I over a cup of coffee 10 years ago, just hashing these things out. Now, these are things that we cannot ignore. No. We can't put our head in the sand over these things. I think a lot of pastors are still not wanting to maybe dive into this the way they could. I want to spend a few minutes here that we have left. Let's talk about the Ezra Institute, the work you guys are doing. I want to make sure our audience is aware so they have you guys as a resource if they're wanting to connect further. And so, how can the average Christian leader or pastor get connected with you guys, and what can they find there?
Mm-hmm. So at Ezra, our whole purpose is to deal with these kinds of issues and to try and help people think biblically, think Christianly about every area of life, not just churchy things, but what does it mean to think Christianly about law, politics, education, the arts, and all of these sorts of areas. And so we have Ezra Media is where you can actually watch lectures, courses, conferences, and that's you can subscribe to Ezra Media, get access to that. We have a weekly podcast, the Podcast for Cultural Reformation, which drops on a Wednesday every week, where we deal with these issues. We have Ezra Press. You've mentioned some of the books. My latest book, Think Christianly, the one that you read a while back, The Mission of God.
Fabulous. Can't recommend that enough. Yeah.
And then Ruler of Kings, Towards a Christian Vision of Government, kind of addresses that sphere sovereignty issue. In here, I do deal with the question of law, nations. How do we think about the nature and character of the nation? Is it a religious root? Is it an ethnic root? And so on. So all the kind of questions that were confronting us, that's what Ezra is trying to address and deal with. So Ezra Press, we've got all kinds of books. And Ezra Institute, we offer training. So we host regional conferences. We're actually willing to go to people's area. If groups of churches want to come together to do a conference, we go to them. And then we offer in-person training, intensive worldview training for young adults and college and career. So you can find out about those things on our website. And one of the things that we would help people to understand is what are the practical steps? How do we understand Islam, for example? And then what do we need to do in terms of outreach to Muslims? I mean, I have a converted Muslim in my family from another country.
That's awesome.
This does happen.
Yes.
What we're talking about at the moment is the political, cultural challenge that Islam presents when you've got, in Britain, for example, 5 MPs who got elected at the last election just on Islamic issues.
Yeah.
And Pete Hegseth made the joke, I think, that, the first major nuclear power of Europe might be Islamic, Britain, and he was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he's serious about the issue. It's a real concern that if we don't get a hold of this situation, we're going to be taken over by it. And so at Ezra, we're trying to help people grapple with all of that and give a coherent, God-centered, Christ-centered response that is about the glory of God, the honor of the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you want to be great in the kingdom, Jesus says, teach his law. If you want to be least, teach people to don't obey it, and teach other people to do the same. So if we're Christians, Jesus says, be concerned with my law. If we're disciples of Jesus, surely we're concerned with the law of God, because he was. And Paul reminds Timothy, the law is good if you use it lawfully.
Great reminder, and Joe, I appreciate so much your time here. We'll have all the links in our show notes, for the resources that you mentioned and everything else. And grab his book, Think Christianly. This is going to be a new one. I'm definitely going through here and reading. Mission of God was fabulous. If you haven't picked that up yet, definitely check that out as well. Thanks for being here on Strong Church with us, and thank you for watching Strong Church. As always, I'm Pastor Lucas Miles, Senior Director here at TPUSA Faith. Until next time, stay strong.